Hello, my name is Evan Perkins. I'm the assistant director here at Gallery Caiaphas, and today I'm talking with Bruce Myren, and we'll be speaking about his current exhibition at Gallery Caiaphas titled Fort Juniper. Bruce Myren is an artist and photographer based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He holds a BFA in photography from the Massachusetts College of Art and Design and earned his MFA in studio art from the University of Connecticut in Storrs in 2009. In his work, Myren investigates issues of place and space, often via the exploration and employment of locative systems, either literal or metaphoric. His 8x10 view camera images provide an intimate exploration of the land surrounding his childhood home in Amherst, Massachusetts. Myren also focuses his camera along the Mill River in Amherst, an area once inhabited by the poet Robert Francis. Regarding Francis, Myren writes, "For Francis, Fort Juniper was more than just an abode in which to reside. It was a fort to shelter him, a lens through which he viewed the world, and a mirror with which to observe his inner states." Myren photographs the land with this in mind, using his surroundings as a way to look inward and reflect upon this place and history of those who have inhabited it. Bruce, thank you for taking the time to sit down and chat with me today.
Thanks for having me. This is exciting.
I love being able to give a face to these images
Yeah.
that we have on the white walls here.
Yeah, yeah.
The images in Fort Juniper provide an intimate and sustained view of your childhood home and its surroundings. What was it about this place that inspired you to return and photograph all these years later?
I was photographing out there kind of intermittently, and I was doing another series called Markers Memory. And in that process, I was standing chest high in the water, in the Mill River, actually, making a photograph about a memory in my childhood. And as I'm sitting there in the water, I realized how close I was to Fort Juniper. Because I've been photographing that area since I was a teenager. I haven't really stopped. I've always just gone out there and made a few pictures here and there. So I realized I was so really close to Fort Juniper. And at the time, I was looking for a project to do for my graduate thesis. And so that was what kind of sparked it for me and made me start doing some research on Fort Juniper and find out about the house and look for, see if it was still owned by the estate or what. So I drove by that day to look at the house, and I noticed that on the mailbox was Robert Francis's name was still on there. So I called UMass Press because that's who owns the rights to his work. And I asked who was responsible for the estate, knowing that Francis had died in '87. They gave me Henry Lyman's name, and I looked him up in the newspaper and in the phone book, actually, and gave him a call, and we started talking. That's really how it kind of started. I think that's what kind of inspired me is that then looking at his poetry, looking at his prose, reading more about him is really what made me start to realize that I wanted to focus on his house. And I made a lot of bad pictures. I made a lot of bad pictures at first, mostly because I think I kept trying to photograph his house. I kept trying to photograph like the experience of the house and not really thinking about myself as much. I was making it a kind of a distant photograph. I was putting some distance between me and the photographs and me and the place. And one day, and I was getting really frustrated. One day I just decided, I realized that I was photographing my own home, and then the pictures just started to flow.
One of the interesting revelations that I had, as I've always loved some of the writings of Thoreau and the naturalist writings, and I remember spending years going back visiting Walden and the areas in Concord, and remembering going back and having there being so many people thinking that it's not about the specific place that's
right.
So important. It's about what that means to you as an individual. For Thoreau, it's kind of like finding your own Walden Pond. What does that what does that mean? What is it that inspires you to live simply and intentionally the way he did? He'd probably be the first to admit that there was nothing special about the place that he was in, particularly in regards to how it interacts with other people. It's all about finding the version of that for yourself. So I think hearing you talk about how the work began to connect with you and you kind of got a little bit of momentum was when you kind of stepped out of photographing in the context of maybe of his life and his experiences and realizing that it was actually, you were photographing where you grew up as well.
Right. Exactly. When I realized I was photographing my home, that the woods were my home, it made it much easier to kind of connect to his relationship to the landscape too. It's funny actually you mention Thoreau because, Francis is more Thoreauvian than Thoreau, really, I think, in some ways. His solitary life, this little tiny house, and, being a vegetarian and not having a car and all that kind of stuff, like, I don't know, in some ways he's very Thoreau-like as an individual.
you also have posted in the gallery his poem entitled Solitude itself as well. And that kind of gives context to the images that you have up on the walls as well. And I wonder, you've done all this research about Robert Francis since photographing and since diving into the project. When were you introduced to him? What was he introduced to you as? I know you mentioned in your artist statement that you realized that you had met him all these years ago. I kind of tying your work to his, I wonder if you view your images kind of functioning in the context of his work, and do you feel that there's a relationship or conversation with his work as well as your own?
Yeah, I like to think there is. I mean, at first, to go to the first part of the question, it had to be like ninth grade when we saw in English class, we saw a video documentary about him, and he was reading poetry at his house, and that's when I first learned of him as a teen. And it wasn't until like I kind of put the two things together later. Seeing this man in the woods with this cap on, and him waving and I'm waving, but we never really spoke. We just kind of saw each other on these trails. And it was later that I kind of put the two together. I suddenly realized, remembered, oh, that's right. We saw this video about this poet and the house. And then, again, like in high school, driving by and seeing the house and putting the two things together, the memory of the video and then the image of the house as I drove by it. I like to think that they're a conversation more than like a one-to-one relationship. Some are very much a one-to-one relationship, especially the ones that are, speaking to a piece of prose or a poem in particular, like Solitaire, those Solitaire pictures, or the northern and southern terminus of A Short Walk. Those come directly from his writing, trying to capture that sense of coming home to window light, to having the warm glow of a window in the winter when it's dark out and you come home, and instead of coming home to a dark house, you come back to a lit house, a house that's welcoming. And then for The Short Walk, it was really me kind of redoing a walk that he describes when he doesn't have time for a proper walk. So when a proper walk is a whole day, and and a short walk is an afternoon or a couple hours. And then he would say that sometimes he was so busy either by writing or taking phone calls or answering letters that he would only have time for a short walk. And that was when he would walk out his driveway and down the street until he could see the next house and then turn around and see the former house. So those ones I think are more like more of a relationship, whereas ones that are more like looking at the footbridge or looking at the river and the reflections of the light on the river and light on the trees, things like that. That's more like a conversation with him over time. Those pictures that are related to directly to a poem or a prose, I think are more like they're more in a relationship as opposed to a conversation. I think I'm really kind of responding. I don't want to say illustrative, in some ways they kind of are, without going too far into that, just illustrating a poem. I don't really want to illustrate a poem, but they become some kind of a illustration of that poem, for lack of a better word. Whereas some of the ones where I'm looking at the river and I'm looking at these pictures here where I'm looking at a bend in the river over time, it's more about my experience on the landscape and my memories of that place, and that becomes a conversation with his work more than a one-to-one relationship or something like that. So this becomes a poetic response to his work. Him being there throughout the seasons and my being out there throughout the seasons.
The relationship between poetry and photography is strong. I think there are a lot of times there's a back and forth between either photographers or poets being inspired by one another and being in conversation with one another. And a lot of it to me is based on the fact that photography and poetry are often, they leave space to be just about observations. It's not an essay that you've worked over for days, weeks, months, years, or a painting that you work on over time. Oftentimes a picture or a line of poetry, it can be as simple as an observation you saw in that moment. I think it's those things that draw us to both photography and poetry, those things that kind of shake us out of our daily routines. Like you mentioned, sometimes you just see the most perfect beam of light or something like that, and it kind of gets me at least out of my routine, or just putting my head down and trudging through whatever it may be doing. It's those little things that wake us back up a little bit, and it lends it a little bit more to things being candid. That's one of the strengths of both of these mediums, and how the images play back and forth.
And that's what's so much about poetry is it's so much it is about an image, a description of an image in so many ways, or an experience. And that's what I try to bring into my work is this sense of experience as well as just the image itself. But I want to have that, I want the viewer to get a sense of experience as well, not just the image on the wall, but, kind of try to feel that the weight of being somewhere. I did try to do that in all my work, and that was a big part of the 40th parallel, was about that sense of being somewhere, that it wasn't just random, even though it was just random. Same with these pictures where, you could think of them as just random places, but I want to have that experiential feel to them. Like you're standing there, like you're walking. And at the same time, I want the pictures to exist in a place where you don't necessarily know exactly where you're standing too, like have a little bit of looseness to the ground in some ways.
In a different way, we talk about how poetry and photography is oftentimes a medium of moments and quick observations. Your work consistently has ties to place in history, typically sustained over a long period of time. You often spend a number of years on any given body of work, whether it be Fort Juniper or you mentioned earlier the 40th parallel. How do you approach photographing places that you're familiar with versus those unknown? Do you find that frequently visiting a place helps give you clarity or some type of intimate relationship with the land? There's an interesting relationship between photographing moments over a long period of time. And I see that running throughout your work. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
It's hard to see things that you've seen your whole life and see them fresh and new in your eyes, because you bring all that experience of that landscape with you when you go to this place that's well known. And so I do this little trick in my head where I try to pretend I just got off a plane and I'd never been there before, that I just was just plunked down in this space. And I try to, in some ways, try to let go of all my experiences of being there and try to get to like where I'm just like seeing the land for the first time. And you can't really do that. It's impossible to get rid of your experience on the landscape. But by just trying to do this mental game with myself, it allows me to start to see things a little bit fresher and a little bit new. Like when I did the 40th parallel, I get in this place where it's just coordinates and I just have to make a good picture there. I try to bring that kind of sensibility to Fort Juniper. But again, the work went over time. Because it's over time, I start to look back at the pictures I've made and have that be the experience that I'm bringing in. So it's like I'm writing new lines to a novel or another line to a poem in some ways when I go back, so that I'm aware of the other pictures and kind of what I might need to make the sentence full, if that makes any sense. I'm trying to get to that part of the intimacy with the landscape, because trying to imagine I've never been there before, that's actually not intimate with the landscape. So then through that lens, I then try to remember and have the experience of the intimacy of the land. And that comes with sitting there and taking time to make a picture, I think, is where the intimacy comes in, where it's not using the view camera and the 8x10 in particular. It takes time to set up a picture. It's not like a digital camera when you go out and you take a bunch of pictures. You're just pushing a button, and you may be contemplating something there, but to set up the 8x10, it takes 10 or 15 minutes to set it up, and then you're looking through the viewfinder, then you're looking at the focus, then you're playing with the focus and where the focus might be in the photograph if you want to have. And this is actually a good example. This picture right now is a good example of where that focus is played with, so that it gives you a sense of moving through the photograph instead of it just being everything sharp. But that kind of sense of being there for a while, I think, brings the intimacy to it. Part of it too is, I think, thinking about print size too. When you're walking through the exhibition, the prints are big, but they're not so big that you have to step back from them. They're big enough that you have a relationship to them. They're human scale. They're only 24 by 30, which, it sounds big when you measure it, but when you put it on a wall, it's not that big. It becomes this kind of, you can get close enough that you can immerse yourself in it, but not so close that not so close that you've lost yourself in it. And I think that helps relate the sense of intimacy to the works.
Yeah, and it was interesting hearing you talk about how you focus the camera and how you portray emotion through that. And that's one thing that I was thinking about. Some of your images is that you're really intentional with the way you play with, with the plane of focus. You have images that are sharp and that are,
Yeah.
like you said, like you mentioned earlier, that may be a little bit more illustrative, but then you also touch on the fact that you wanted these to be more like traces. They're fleeting, like you're walking through the woods. And
Yeah.
I think being able to not having every photograph read as a document, but rather
Right.
as a suggestion, I think that's a really effective way through the work, that you're able to give us a little bit of both, right? Because I think
Thanks.
this work has two aspects of it, because in one sense you are kind of paying homage to somebody that you shared this space with, whose work has been an influence of yours, but there's also a sense of you making your own work that's inspired by it, and that's, your interpretation of it. And I think that there's more than enough space for both of those in a body of work, and it gives it a nice push and pull, a little bit of a back and forth between two conversations throughout the work, which is really great to see.
Thanks very much.
Well, and then I have an installation view here for people to see. There's a wonderful installation that you have in the back of the gallery, literally tracing the land that these pictures live in. So I do want to thank you for taking the time to sit down with me and chat today.
Yeah.
For everyone that's listening and wants to keep up with your work, where can we see new work?
I just built a new website that I'm really happy with. So it's on my website, which is brucemyren.com. It's the best place to find the images. The whole show is in there. I haven't put up an installation view yet, so I'm gonna do that today. But all the work's there, and my other projects are there. The 40th Parallel, the View Home, which is about pictures of my house that I live in now from every place else I've lived in Massachusetts. That's on there, and then some of the other pictures. Some of the other projects like Marker's History and Marker's Memory are both on there now, as well as some videos. So that's where that would be the best place to go look for, is brucemyren.com.
Awesome. Thanks, Bruce. Really great talking with you, and can't wait to share this work with everybody. And then for those listening, this work is on view through the 28th of November. Come on in and see it. It's a really beautiful exhibition, and your strong relationship to the work comes through.
Thank you very much, Evan.